Hello and welcome to the session. Now our title today is Demystifying Language, Spelling, Lexis and Grammar. Now I'm Mr. Craven, Senior Director of English for NET, and today we're going to be taking off the lid and poking around in the workings of language, looking at the nuts and bolts, the processes that allow English to function as a living language. Now the aim of the session is to look at those three linked areas: spelling, lexis, vocabulary, and grammar, and to unpack the rules that govern them, their applicability to teaching in the classroom, and some of the stumbling blocks along the way to understanding. Now for many people it's this part of language, the formal, technical, mechanical side of English, that is both most intimidating and most mysterious. Now this session will, hopefully, make it seem a little less arcane and a little more accessible. Let's turn back to spelling. Now in our previous session I spoke briefly about why English spelling is so complicated, and let's start by being frank. It is complicated. Now you'll no doubt have heard at various points over the years about the wonders of the Finnish education system. There's a range of reasons for this, with researchers often nodding sagely at the lack of standardised testing, the low accountability for teachers, cooperation between schools, a firm focus on equitable education, a later starting age of students, more relaxed school environments, greater professional respect for teachers, low levels of homework. And many, or indeed all of these, may be true. However, Finland's between 99 and 100% literacy rate, our status as the world's most literate nation, can also be partially attributed to its language. Now, although Finnish has an alphabet of 29 letters compared to the 26 that we have in English, it has a significantly smaller core vocabulary than English. It's got fewer linguistic influences, fewer borrowings from other languages, and most importantly, a spelling system in which each letter corresponds almost exclusively to a single sound. That means that if you know the alphabet in Finnish, you can spell almost any word you come across based purely on how it sounds. Now compare that to English, where there are 26 letters, 44 sounds roughly, and more than 200 possible letter and sound combinations, where, as in the previous session, a letter such as O can make different sounds in words such as orange, hotel, to, colour, lemon, wolf, and women. Now about 75% of English spelling is relatively regular, but that still leaves 25% worth of irregular spellings, including some absolute stonkers. Now Bill Bryson, in his excellent book Mother Tongue, which is all about English, he offers the example of the spelling G-H-O-T-I, which spells fish, obviously. After all, in a word such as enough or rough, the GH is providing the F sound. In the word women, the O is making an I sound, while if we turn to a word such as motion or emotion, the TI is the section making a sh, so G-H-O-T-I could spell fish based on English spelling. Now, why is English so complicated? Well, again, as we mentioned before, it's because in no small part of England's cultural and geopolitical history. Now, thanks to invasions and settlement, we've ended up with a whole lot of Germanic Anglo-Saxon vocabulary and grammar. There are some Celtic traces, some Scandinavian influences. There's Latin and Greek, Trojan horsed in through religious, literary and administrative texts. French and German influences have come from the Normans, both of those also influenced by Greek and Latin themselves. And then there's 1,000 years of trade, exploration and empire that brought in influences from Dutch, Spanish, Italian, Yiddish, Arabic, Persian, Hindi, Mandarin, Japanese. Now historically there's been a tendency for the English to view their history as imposing Britishness on other countries and cultures. And to an extent that's true. But it also ignores the influences coming the other way. Without Hindi and Urdu, for example, we would never have adopted words such as pyjamas, dinghy, shampoo, chutney or jodhpur. We'd have no bangles to wear, no bungalows to live in, no cots for babies to sleep in, no khaki for soldiers to wear, no mantras to guide us, no punch to drink, no pundits to help us understand sports, no thugs getting violent, no bazaars to shop in. And every time we borrowed words from other languages, we've also been influenced by some of their pronunciations and their spelling patterns. In a sense, when we gaze into an abyss, the abyss gazes also into us, to paraphrase Nietzsche. Now, what this means is that English spelling is a partially regularized system, borrowing from literally hundreds of other languages. To make matters even more complicated, when other languages have useful words but a different alphabet, we've ended up imposing our own alphabet on their words, something that hasn't always been as successful or as reliable as originally expected. And pronunciations have changed over time. In Old English, for example, which is largely Germanic, a knight, K-N-I-G-H-T, now pronounced with a silent K, would have been pronounced knecht. In the middle of our legs, we'd have had a knie and perhaps carried a knife. And imagine trying to explain that as part of a logical, systematic approach to spelling for a child. I mean, more recently, there's been a shift from music having a tune to having a tune, or even a tune. Rewind a few years, and this might have caused a controversy, rather than as now, a controversy. We might have spoken about what we ate, rather than ate, or posted a letter in an envelope, rather than in an envelope, as it would be now. Now, sometimes these changes drift away from an originally logical spelling. At other times, as in envelope or envelope, the pronunciation shifts to match the spelling. Either way, it complicates things. So how are children taught spelling? If we rewind to the mid and late 20th century, various debates were raging about whole word reading, phonics, and many more. And this meant that the way spelling was taught in schools was varied and variable from school to school. For many of us, the traditional, here's a letter, here's what it's called, and here's the sound it makes approach ended up with us knowing that there's a letter T, which makes the sound T. And now read, and never ever call the letter T again. Tricky things like the impact of consonants on vowels, sounds represented by multiple letters and so on were skated over, and picked up often simply by educational osmosis. The more we read, the more someone told us that we'd read or spelled it wrong, and here was the great version, the more we picked up. Of course, this didn't work for everyone, and that's a limiting factor in terms of adult literacy across the UK and beyond. Now, things have moved on. When children learn spelling rules in primary schools now, typically from about nursery through to year 3, they're generally taught using phonics, which is also called synthetic phonics. Now, what this is basically is a layered set of spelling rules and patterns, starting with individual or pure sounds, as they're often called. So, for example, children would be taught the letter M as M rather than M or M. The idea is that this makes it significantly easier moving forward to blend sounds together, to combine them. Now, to return to my previous comments about old-fashioned ways of teaching spelling, for example, if a student is reading C-A-T, using the adult alphabet, the word would come out as C-A-T, which is wildly wrong. Even reading using the child alphabet, many of my generation were taught, produces some very odd results, ending up with K-A-T-A or karata, which is better but still wrong. Now, with the C, the K, we need to avoid adding the or an sound afterwards, as with the T as well, the T, K, rather than K or K, T, rather than T or T, and that way, we end up with cat. Now, of course, not every sound fits with a single letter. Often we use 2 or 3 letter combinations called digraphs, 2 letter combinations, and trigraphs, 3. Digraphs include the AY in day, the OU in out, or the TH in teeth. There's even such a thing as a split digraph, where the letter at the end of the word influences the sound of a letter inside it, as with the A and E in make, or the E and E in these, or the O and E in home. Notice that the final E is something of a common factor for those. Now, when students take words to bits, when they dissect them into their component parts, it's known as segmenting, which is logical. Now, from these initial letter-sound combinations, or graphemic-phonemic correspondences to give them their proper name, children then move on to blending sounds, firstly just in sections and then in shaping words. When they make this shift, students are supported in learning what we call high-frequency words, words that they should rapidly learn simply by their visual appearance, the shape of them, rather than needing to decode them bit by bit every time. Now these would include words such as number, shape and the, and this is another step towards reading like an adult, where we do read by those shapes. In addition to logical words, primary school students are also taught something called irregular words, common exception words, sight words, or even tricky words. Now whatever they call them, what these are, regardless of those names, is words that don't fit predictable patterns. Want, W-A-N-T, for example, has the O sound rather than the A. It's not want, it's want. We've also got words such as swan, they, my, and are. Now primary classrooms, as many of you will know, are often festooned with displays, flashcards and word mats, and they're to help reinforce these. Now throughout the upper years of primary school, pupils go home every week with lists of common exception words and tricky words to learn, to memorise, and these can be easily accessed on almost any primary school's website. What this does mean is there's a ready-made list of relatively tricky words that we can also usefully implement with our students in secondary and through our lessons. And if you're teaching years 7 to 9, you'll find a significant chunk of those words built into the medium-term planning and into the overviews for any of the schemes of work that we use. Even moving into year 10 and 11, you'll still find schemes building in vocabulary lists, both technical and non-technical, with the full intention that these function in more or less the same way as primary school, offering some continuity. So what about spelling rules? What are some of these spelling rules? Well, some of them will be all too painfully familiar, such as the old classic I before E except after C. Now in general, that isn't a bad bit of advice, especially with lots of the keywords, the common words, the students will learn first. However, the problem is that it doesn't work in a very, very large number of cases. Neighbour, way, nay, sleigh, neither, either, height, leisure, weird, caffeine, protein, seas, science. And if we try to take all of those variations into account, what we end up with as a rule is perhaps something more like I before E except after C, or when like A, as in neighbour and way, but drop this rule when a C sounds like a sh, which isn't as catchy. And even that isn't perfect. Like many of the apparent rules, these are useful for initial steerage, and they're often correct. But we have to be aware and be honest about the fact that there are exceptions, there are variations, and so on. Now that said, there are some rules that are actually more or less rules. For example, every word, in fact, every syllable, has at least one vowel sound. Q is followed by U. Words don't end in V or J. And those are almost always rules. However, it gets tricky when we factor in that letters that are theoretically consonants, such as the Y, can make vowel sounds in words such as rhythm. And that where we have consonant clusters, we do often build in vowel sounds without them being represented by a letter, as with the at the end of the word rhythm. It's a thumb at the end rather than a thumb, rhythm. You'll also find from a linguistic perspective that it's often vowel sounds which provide a lot of the regional variations, the accents, and that can lead to locally specific spelling issues. There are variations to the pronunciation of consonants, but they're less frequent, and they're often less dramatic. Consonants are more consistent in terms of how they're pronounced. Now, to return to that previous list, we also need to remember that the Q rule, the QU, doesn't apply in words from the Arabic language family at times, such as Suk or Iraq. And the V and J rule doesn't apply sometimes to words such as Mazel Tov from Yiddish, or Leitmotif from German, to Hajj from Arabic, or Raj from Hindi. There are exceptions to them. Now, for the most part, what that means is that what we present as rules, especially to young children, are actually just trends or tendencies, and these can be usefully picked up and delivered, as long as we keep an eye out for exceptions. Now, obviously, homophones are a key source of errors. Now, homophones, from homo meaning same and phone meaning sound, these are words that sound the same but are spelled differently, such as two, and two. TWO, TOO, and TO. Your, and your. YOU apostrophe RE, YOUR, YORE, and YAW. There, and there. THERE, THEIR, and THEY apostrophe RE, and even here and here. HERE and HEAR. Now, for most of these, there can be quick ways, shortcuts, to getting students to understand them. For your and your, as in YOU apostrophe RE and YOUR, ensuring students think about the former of those being short for you are usually solves the issue, and it's a useful way of linking in apostrophes of omission, which we'll talk about a bit later. For there, and there, THERE, THEIR, and THEY apostrophe RE, again, thinking about they are could help them with THEY apostrophe RE. Remembering that the I in their THEIR makes it about a person, so it's the belonging to one. Or remembering equally that THERE has got here, HERE, in. And if there has got here in, it must be about a place, as in where. Now to link to that, for here and here, HERE and HEAR, remembering that here, HEAR, has got ear in it, so it's about sounds. Here, HERE is like there and where, so it's about a place. Now for many of these, you'll work out your own routines and advice, and that's absolutely fine. But it's also worth listening out for examples from experienced staff, particularly from our primary academies. Now where students do make mistakes, there are a few logical approaches that can be helpful. On a basic level, return to primary school style teaching. Get students to sound it out phonetically. Obviously, this only works where spellings are phonetically logical. For example, students often write meat for, MEATPHOR, rather than metaphor, smiley rather than simile, and solider rather than soldier. In each of those cases, getting students to read out the words by sounds can help them to see that they're incorrect. The mistakes often happen because students apply familiar shapes from other words. Meat, M-E-A-T, shapes how they spell metaphor because the first four letters are the same. Smile influences simile because actually the word simile is very close to smile in terms of the spelling. Solid influences soldier. Now students are applying higher frequency word spellings to lower frequency and more challenging spellings. It's logical. We just need to unpick it and unpack it. Linked to that, getting students to pronounce words correctly and modelling that correct pronunciation can be invaluable. For example, many students spell being, B-E-I-N-G, as bean, B-E-E-N, or even bean, B-E-A-N. And that's because they clip the ng, into n. With the word pronounced formally, the spelling issue decreases or even disappears. As a different example, students often spell a lot, as a lot, A-L-L-O-T. And that's because they're used, when they say it, to running the words together. As a more extreme example, I've come across a number of students writing about handbags, H-A-M-B-A-G-S, handbags, rather than handbags. Now again, a more formal and a more careful pronunciation would clear these up. That said, with any approach relying on sounds, it's important to remember that students may have accents where the logical spelling, based on how their teacher speaks, doesn't apply. And that's something just to watch out for. Another approach, get students to segment the word, number 3 here. By taking it to bits, students can see the smaller sections with logical pronunciations. For example, students often spell possession, P-O-S-S-E-S-S-I-O-N, as P-O-S-S-E-S-S-I-O-N, and across, A-C-R-O-S-S, as A-C-C-R-O-S-S. Now you can get students to see that if they can spell the word possess, P-O-S-S-E-S-S, which lots of them can, they just need to add ion at the end, I-O-N. And if they can spell cross, we'll just add an A. It's a way of making the whole thing more logical. Handkerchief is another example. If you remember that it's a kerchief that's in your hand, then that D doesn't disappear. Now, links to the above, number 4 here. Getting students to spot links in the sections. Remembering that tricycle is spelled like that because tri is 3, like triangle, and cycle as in, well, the various places they come across the word. It's worth watching out for students routinely making the same pattern error in different words. That's when it needs to be a wider conversation and a wider focus, rather than just occurring in a single word. But this is often something that teachers don't immediately spot. We spot the single error and focus on that, rather than looking at the broader patterns and the broader issues. Now, number 5 here. For some trickier spellings, there are some useful phrases or mnemonics. For example, necessary, 1 collar, 2 sleeves, 1 C, 2 S's. Separate, there's a rat in separate, rat. Because, big elephants can always understand small elephants. Because, B-E-C-A-U-S-E. Although it can also be useful with because to segment it into be and cause. Now, from a teaching perspective, it's important to look out for where the spelling issues are general across a group and therefore need explicit class teaching, and where they're localized within a smaller group, needing some small group intervention, or even specific to a single student, an individual, and therefore needing individual interaction and support. And it's important to see where those occur and the level of intervention required. As a quick side note, every teacher at some point makes a spelling mistake on a handout, on a presentation, or when writing on whiteboards. It happens to the best of us and to the rest of us. And when this happens and a student points it out, all you need to do is agree, correct, thank them, and move on. It's also a useful learning point for them to see that everybody makes these mistakes, and it's not something to get hung up on. Now, students often spell the names of writers incorrectly, and that's a key thing, especially as we move into more literature-focused work, and especially at Key Stage 4. Priestley, the writer of Inspector Calls, for example, P-R-I-E-S-T-L-E-Y, spelled Priestley, P-R-I-E-S-T-L-Y, as if it's an adverb, and that's a prime example, although Shakespeare is perhaps the most common misspelling. Now, in those instances, the previously discussed approaches can work, but it's also important for students to regularly see the relevant spelling, and that's to help them build visual familiarity, and also to practice writing the correct version so that the accurate spelling sinks into their long-term memory, and also that it works with their hands in terms of muscle memory. It's fairly useless to get a student to correct a spelling once, since it doesn't make it memorable. To fix it, to make it sticky, it needs repeating to help with the visual and physical aspects of spelling. It's also very, very important to check corrected spellings. Now, the nightmare scenario, and you come across this sometimes, would be where a student corrects their mistake incorrectly and ends up simply compounding the error and reinforcing the initial mistake. Now, I've already mentioned historically based spelling patterns that we're left with as a linguistic legacy, the K on night, the P on psychology. Now, there are clusters of these. You can find them as a sort of a pattern. There's night with a K, knock with a K, knee with a K, psychology, psychiatry, psychosis, all with that silent P on the front. But realistically, unless you can encourage students to recognize the underlying idea that links them, so the idea of the mind for the PSY, the psi, for example, it's really simply a case for most students of treating these words as common exception words and drilling them as much as possible. As a final complication, it's also worth thinking about the increasing influence of American English, where some spellings are historically based, such as aluminum, which is the way it used to be spelled across in the UK as well. And there's others which are influenced by attempts, especially in the 19th century, to simplify American spelling, such as colour, C-O-L-O-R. Now, with these, students can be applying logical patterns based on a range of external influences, some of them formally valid, and that means that they need to be addressed as if they're tricky or irregular spellings. Students are, as we know, exposed to a huge range of American influences across all the media they consume. And it's also noticeable that many of these influences come through social media, and those in particular expose them to variant spellings or phonetic spellings. The more time they spend being influenced by these, the more those spellings become reinforced or fixed even. And this means that if you have students who are active gamers, TikTokers, tweeters, Instagrammers, and all the other platforms, these students may often acquire fixed spelling behaviours that will need unpicking and then reconstructing. Now, that's a lot of discussion about spelling, so let's look at some grammar. Now, for many staff, grammar is what terrifies them. They're scared of making grammatical errors themselves, and they're terrified of the fiddly, technical side of it. Now, if you're from a similar generation to me, there was very, very little formal teaching of the details and the technical specificities of grammar. Word classes were something we encountered much later, if at all. Children now arriving in secondary, having been through our primary system, are far more informed and confident with discussing simple sentences, clauses, phrases. They can confidently construct a sentence with a fronted adverbial and explain to you precisely what one of those is. And what it is when an adverb or a phrase doing the job of an adverb, an adverbial, is placed at the beginning of the sentence before the verb. Now, most children arriving in year 7 understand this now. Very few adults do. That means that there's a reasonable chance, especially for non-specialists, that some students may know more about grammar than the teachers do. Now, as with almost all of the spelling and grammatical rules, this doesn't mean that people unable to label them don't understand them on some level. It's often just that they don't know how to articulate it, how it's systematized. It's simply something that they've gradually acquired, that socio-cultural and educational osmosis again. Now, we can't expect to understand every single thing about grammar. There isn't time, and that's a lifelong project. Even Professor Steven Pinker, one of my favourite linguists, who has a real passion for grammar, readily admits that even he is still constantly learning about grammar. Now, what we do need is enough of a grounding to pick up on the key issues and errors that students have and that they make. Enough grammar to allow us to work with text in the classroom and to ensure that we are modelling content effectively for students, and particularly effectively for students who are non-native speakers of English, where grammar in their native language may be different. Now, let's unpack some of those basics. Now, the basic building block of a sentence is the words within it, and as we've said, we classify those based on what they do. So, as a quick potted version, let's start with nouns. Now, nouns are names of things, and that's a useful way of remembering. Noun, name. Essentially, if the word is a label for something, it's a noun, and nouns are the most common word class. Now, these can be something general, like a book, a shop, a tree, a car, and these are common nouns. It can be something specific, such as Newcastle, Craven, or Tesco, and these are all proper nouns, taking capital letters. It can be something intangible, the name of an idea or a feeling, something ephemeral such as thought, emotion, hatred, and those are abstract nouns. Some nouns can describe a group of things, such as a class, a heap, a school, a herd, and those are collective nouns. Now, typically, we add an S suffix if we're being technical, to the end of a noun to make it plural. But this isn't always the case, as in when we have multiple deer. Many small children, for example, add an S to sheep to make the plural, sheeps, when the singular and plural forms, sheep, are actually identical. Now, if we took, for example, the sentence, Joe drove his flashy car quickly along the busy road, you'd spot that Joe is a proper noun, capital J right there. Car is a common noun, and road is also a common noun, and those in that sentence are the three naming words, the three nouns. Now, adjectives are one of the two word classes that we add to things, that we use to describe things. And the things they describe, unsurprisingly, are nouns. Adjectives can appear in their base form, such as pretty or small. Adjectives can be comparative, such as prettier or smaller. Adjectives can be superlative, such as prettiest or smallest. And for the most part, that's it. Base, comparative, superlative. Er for comparative, est, est for superlative. However, there are some adjectives that don't fit this pattern. For example, something or someone can't be beautifulest or beautifuler. It has to be the most beautiful or more beautiful. Someone can't be the creativist or creativer. Again, more creative, most creative. Some adjectives can't be comparative or superlative at all. Unique is a prime example. Now, unique means one of a kind. So something can't be very unique or quite unique. It either is or it isn't. Fatal is another example. Something can't be a bit fatal or very fatal. Again, it either is or it isn't. Now, if we head back to that sentence, Joe drove his flashy car quickly along the busy road. You'd spot this time that flashy describes the car, making it an adjective, and busy describes the road, so busy is also an adjective. As a rule of thumb, if it's linked to and telling you about a thing, it's an adjective. Now, verbs are next to nouns, the words that do some of the heaviest lifting in a sentence, the most important words, and they're often called doing words or action words. Now, for the most part, that's true. I can lift a weight, verb. I can drive a car, verb. However, be is also a verb, as is exist, and neither really requires an action to take place. There are even some helping verbs, called modal verbs, that can't be a main verb in a sentence. Words such as could, would, shall, may, and must, and so on. Now, modal verbs are all about possibility or probability. Verbs also change depending on when they happen. We can have a past tense verb, I lifted, I drove. Now, usually these take an ed ending, such as lifted, but not always, as in drove. Now, where verbs fit the usual patterns, ed, ing, and s, they're known as regular verbs. And if they don't fit those patterns, they are irregular verbs. Now, to turn back to verb tenses, we can also have a present tense verb, and that usually takes an ing and an ing ending. For example, I am lifting, I am driving. That said, I work, she swims. I work and she swims are also classed as present tense. Now, essentially, to simplify it, if it involves something happening now, it's present tense. We can even have a verb taking place in the future. I will lift, I will drive, I might swim. But you'll spot that making the future tense verb requires another word, those modal verbs again. There's also an infinitive form of the verb, an infinitive. And this is the one that doesn't specify a time frame, it's infinite. For example, to go, to swim, to dream. And sometimes it's easiest to remember it as the verb form that you can add a to in front of. And it's infinitive because it's infinite. It doesn't end. Now, to turn back to our sentence, Joe drove his flashy car quickly along the busy road. The only verb in there is, of course, drove. And drove is an irregular past tense verb. So, adjectives describe nouns. So what do adverbs do? Well, we literally add adverbs to verbs. We add to verbs adverbs. They describe verbs, essentially. In a more complete sense, they tell us how, when, or where something happened. Now, to unpack that, let's take the verb swim. Now, how could a person be swimming? Quickly, adverb. Slowly, adverb. Noisily, adverb. Carefully, quietly, painstakingly. They're all adverbs. Now, you'll notice that a lot of adverbs end in ly, and you'll often find students define them as ly words. And in many cases, this is true. But it's an unhelpful definition for a few reasons. For one, it doesn't require students to actually understand what an adverb does, which is actually the important bit. For another, there are, as ever, exceptions. Lovely is an adjective, not an adverb, despite ending in ly. Elderly is the same. Now, we did say that adverbs can tell us when or where something happened as well. We've spoken about the how. What about when and where? Well, for example, I was swimming yesterday. I swam earlier. I will swim tomorrow. Yesterday, earlier, tomorrow. Adverbs. I was swimming outside, inside, upstairs, downstairs. And outside, inside, upstairs, downstairs. Those are also adverbs telling us where. Now, where it can get slightly confusing is where some functional words are also included as adverbs. For example, very and extremely. Adverbs can also, you'll find, describe either adjectives or they can describe other adverbs. For example, she was extremely red, and there extremely, an adverb, is describing red, which is of course the adjective. He drove beautifully carefully, and beautifully there, an adverb, is describing the adverb carefully. Now, just to return briefly to that famously complicated and seemingly arcane piece of primary terminology, the fronted adverbial. Where we begin a sentence with an adverb, we do indeed have a fronted adverbial. Slowly he climbed the hill. Fronted adverbial. Happily they skipped into the classroom. Fronted adverb. Carefully she phrased her examples. Fronted adverb or fronted adverbial. And to return again to our sentence, Joe drove his flashy car quickly along the busy road. Well, we only had one verb, and we've only got one adverb, quickly. Now, a quick tip before we go any further. With those word classes, a useful technique for helping students to work through the word classes is to have a prompt phrase, such as, Frank drove the red car slowly down the road. Now, students can then see which word their word could replace. Which one could it stand in for and still make grammatical sense? If it replaces Frank, it's a proper noun. If it replaces drove, it's a verb, and so on. Now, the meaning, if we do that, may not always make sense. Steve swam the big red ball quickly along the tree. But it's the grammatical fit that's the important bit. Just a useful idea there. Now, there are other word classes. Nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs are the big four. But there are some minor classes as well that you may come up against. Pronouns are one of them. Now, pronouns are basically words that stand in for nouns. For example, I can say that Joe Craven is speaking right now, but it seems odd to refer to myself in the third person. Instead, I can say that I am speaking right now, and I is a pronoun. Now, pronouns can be first person, as in I, we, me, us, my. They can be second person, as in you, or third person even, as in he, she, they, it. First person, essentially, includes the speaker. Second person is addressing the speaker. And third person is referring to someone or something else outside the direct frame of reference. Now, pronouns can be plural, as in we, us, they, or them. Pronouns can be singular, as in I, me, he, or she. Pronouns can be possessive, as in my or your. They can be reflexive, as in myself or yourselves. Now, students often confuse pronouns with proper nouns, but pronouns are an altogether different beast. In some parts of the country, you may also find dialect pronoun usages. So, for example, you may find students asking, why are you staring at us, when referring only to themselves. In places, they may pluralise the second person. Yous lot need to get moving. Where there are local pronoun differences, this can also lead to grammatical errors and confusion over how and when you pluralise nouns, for fairly obvious reasons. Don't forget, by the way, that you've also got the archaic pronouns, the old-fashioned, outdated pronouns, thou, thee, and thy, as you'll find in any Shakespeare plays that you teach. Now, in simple terms, thou and thee just mean you, while thy means your, as in belonging to you. Thou is, of course, the equivalent of du in German, or tu in French, and it shares the origins of both words. Thou, thee, and thy are, as with their French and German cousins, informal. So if you know the Lord's Prayer, when someone says, hallowed be thy name, they are, in a sense, speaking in a personal, informal, intimate manner, and not with the elaborate formality that some people assume now. Now, connectives and conjunctions are another word class it's worth knowing. Unsurprisingly, connectives are words or phrases that connect things, that join sections of a sentence together. And is, unsurprisingly, the key example. But we've also got for, nor, because, or, yet, and a number of others. Essentially, if it's joining things together, it's a connective. Now, a quick word of warning, just when we were achieving some clarity. Some words can be more than one word class, depending on how they're used. For example, blue can be a noun. There's a colour called blue. However, it can also be an adjective. The car is blue, or I'm feeling blue. Love can be a noun. There is an emotion called love. I feel love. It can also, however, be a verb. I love it. She loves him. And so on. When students select words in a text, they often leap to the first word class they know it can be. But that's regardless of whether it actually is that word class in that sentence construction. For example, in the sentence, I feel an overwhelming... I'll start that again. In the sentence, I feel an overwhelming sense of love, students often leap at love as a verb because they know it can be, regardless of the fact that in that particular construction, it's actually a noun. So, we've got words, our building blocks. The most important word classes are, of course, nouns and verbs. They're structurally most important, and they do most of the heavy lifting in terms of the meaning. Now, in actual fact, to have a standard grammatical sentence, we need both of those things. We need nouns or pronouns and verbs. So, for example, I am writing. Beth was singing. The dog will be eating. In each case, we have either a noun, Beth, dog, or a pronoun standing in for a noun, I. And we'll also have a verb, writing, singing, eating. In actual fact, arguably the shortest possible English sentence is I am, with I as the pronoun and am as the verb. Now that structure is the most common structure in English sentences. A noun, known grammatically as the subject, followed by a verb, known grammatically as, well, the verb. Now beyond that, we can simply expand by adding words. The dog is eating. The lazy, grey, smelly dog is eating noisily, aggressively and excitedly outside. Now you'll notice in those two examples that they share the exact same number of nouns and verbs. Dog, eating, dog, eating. It's additional words, the adjectives and adverbs that have been added. Do watch out though for a second noun that the first noun is acting on. The cat sat on the mat, for example, where the second noun is known as the object. Now when we get a sentence like this, obviously it will always begin with a capital letter and end with a full stop or a similar punctuation mark. Now we call these kinds of sentences where we get one set of nouns and a verb simple sentences. They're usually short, but that said, loaded with enough adjectives and adverbs, they don't necessarily have to be short. So for example, the cat sat on the mat. We could also have the huge, greasy, belligerent cat sat painfully and slowly on the threadbare brown mat. Now again, a subject noun, cat, a verb, sat, and an object noun, mat. And then in the second example, just a load of adjectives and adverbs thrown in for good measure. Now the reason why the word order in the sentence, subject noun, verb, object noun, is important is because it can impact on meaning if it's rearranged. For example, the mat sat on the cat. Sat the mat on the cat mat sat on mat cat the sat. Now in each of those examples, meaning is either changed beyond recognition, as in the mat sat on the cat, which is inverted, or it's been obscured to the point of lacking meaning. Now reversing the subject and object nouns inverts the meaning. Beginning with a verb makes it a command. Essentially, grammar matters. And you do need to be aware and to watch out for the fact that grammar does vary in other languages. Word order is not the same in constructions in other European languages even. Now grammar and syntax, as we mentioned in a previous session, just make sure that we're all clear about what links with what, and that we are communicating clearly, concisely, and meaningfully. Now, if a sentence has more than one of those single sentence sections, those clauses in it, it's known as either a compound sentence or a complex sentence. Now, a compound sentence is made up of two equal sections, two main clauses, as they're known. And those are both capable of standing by themselves if needed. For example, if we took the cat sat on the mat, but the dog sat on the floor, full stop. Now, both of the sections in the sentence would make perfect sense by themselves. The cat sat on the mat, full stop. The dog sat on the floor, full stop. But instead, in our compound sentence, they're joined by the connective but. Now, a complex sentence is similar in terms of having more than one section, more than one clause. But in a complex sentence, the two halves of the sentence aren't equal. One could stand by itself as a sentence. The other couldn't. For example, edging through the doorway, Greg arrived late for the lesson. Now here, edging through the doorway doesn't make sense by itself. You couldn't have edging through the doorway full stop, because you're not specifying what's edging through the doorway. We need the bit about Greg to understand what's going on and who it's happening to. In contrast, Greg arrived late for the lesson full stop is perfectly logical in and of itself. Now, when we have that kind of smaller sentence, that smaller phrase, edging through the doorway, which can't stand or make sense by itself, it's called a subordinate clause. What's worth noticing is that subordinate clauses can move around, appearing at the beginning of the main clause, as in edging through the doorway, comma, Greg arrived late for the lesson, or they can be embedded in the middle of the main clause. Greg, edging through the doorway, arrived late for the lesson. Or they can even appear at the end of the main clause. Greg arrived late for the lesson, edging through the doorway. Now, what you'll find is that students almost universally head straight for a simple sentence, where better writing actually involves a mixture of those three kinds. When you look at teaching any kind of textual genre, whether it's fiction or non-fiction, sentence variation is almost always a key focal area for development for students. Now, that said, sentence length can also be a barrier for students in terms of reading. After all, when we read a sentence such as "the cat sat on the mat," we're reading the word cat and storing it until we get to sat, connecting the two, and then placing it on the mat. Now, the load in that on our working memory is very, very small. However, if we take a more complex sentence, such as glowering at the world through a thicket of dark eyebrows and lashes, Emily waited outside the doctor's door, we need to factor in the need to retain several bits of information, glowering and eyebrows, before connecting them with the individual Emily, what she's doing, waiting, and where she is, outside the doctor's door. It's a much heavier load in terms of working memory to retain those things all the way through that lengthy sentence. And it's therefore likely to decrease the kind of detail, the kind of specificity, and the kind of inference recalled and engaged with by students. And that's why sentence length is one of the key factors involved in calculating the reading age of a text. Now, there can be various ways of teaching sentence variation, and especially with less able or younger students, it's often simply worth encouraging students to practice constructing all three kinds of sentence, including the various placements for subordinate clauses, and also to practice expanding their sentences with adjectives and adverbs before using them in a longer text. Essentially, construct a clause, try it out in different sentence forms, and expand it as well. Now, as a training wheels exercise, this could follow quite a rigid, prescriptive routine to help them understand it, before then letting them have more freedom when they've actually mastered the skill. Now, you will come across some more of these grammatical rules, these grammar rules, that are often simply personal preferences or preferable rather than necessary. For example, not starting a sentence with a connective. And did those feat in ancient times. Avoiding double negatives. I am not ungrateful for your sacrifice. Not ending in a preposition. I was looking under. Not splitting an infinitive. To boldly go. Now, in all of these cases, these rules are taught to younger children as absolutes. And that's in order to instill good practice. However, The majority of great writers have created their own distinctive style by ignoring some of those rules. Now, Shakespeare, when you look closely, is an absolute so-and-so for defying what we'd now see as grammatical good practice, but making it work beautifully. Of course, and as we'll talk about in a later session, the Elizabethans didn't have the same kind of codified approach to language that we have now. There weren't established rules about grammar and spelling in quite the same sense. So, we've got words, we've got sentences. We just need to look quickly at punctuation. Now, punctuation serves an important function. It helps represent in writing what our voices do in speech. Where our voices go up or down, where a word or a phrase gains or loses emphasis. Now, I can't, for example, fully make clear that I sound excited when using the word surprise. So, what do? I add an exclamation mark. Now, punctuation can also help to visually connect and to organise information that we're writing down, showing how ideas link, how they contrast, how they build on each other, that sort of thing. Now, full stops are, of course, the most basic punctuation marks, simply closing off a sentence. However, these have also given rise to a range of other punctuation marks, all linked by having that full stop at the bottom. Exclamation marks showing excitement, showing anger or loudness. Full stop at the bottom. Question marks showing an upward inflection and shaping the sentence into a question. Full stop at the bottom. Now, we know that those do the job of a full stop because it's right there, visible at the bottom of the punctuation mark. Now, commas are clearly reasonably easy things, separating off words or phrases, whether in a list or as part of a set of multiple items. But they can dramatically change the meaning of something, as in the old classic of let's eat, comma, grandma, so grandma let's eat, or let's eat grandma, no comma, and therefore cannibalism. Now, colons can introduce a list or an item. They can stand between two sentences if the second one links to the first, or they can introduce a lengthy quotation. Now, semicolons, and not winky faces, as I've heard some students calling them, semicolons are the colon's younger, slightly less impressive brother, and they perform a similar function. In a sense, a semicolon is midway between a colon, which is quite a severe break, and a comma, which is a much more gentle break. And that's why semicolons look as they do. They're essentially, aren't they, half a colon and a comma. Now, semicolons can join two equal ideas in a sentence, such as, some students read passionately, semicolon, others prefer to watch YouTube. Semicolons can also separate multi-word items in a list. In your sentences, you could use strings of full stops, which are basic, semicolon, or exclamation marks and question marks, which are more interesting, full stop. Phrases separated by the semicolon. Now, semicolons were previously viewed as almost the key punctuation mark that gained students high marks in an exam. Thankfully, that's disappeared over the past few years. In fact, many linguists are predicting the semicolons will actually disappear entirely from the language within the next few decades. Now, apostrophes come in two varieties. There's possession and omission. Apostrophes of possession are easy. Basically, when something belongs to something or someone, we use an apostrophe before an additional S if one's being added, or after the existing S at the end of the word if there's one there already. For example, the boy's book. The boy, apostrophe S, book, one boy. The girl's football. Girl, S, apostrophe. And that's belonging to a group of girls because the S was already there, pluralizing girl. Dickens' novels. And that's Dickens, apostrophe, novels, belonging to Dickens. But his name already ends in an S, so we simply add an apostrophe. Now, students often try to add apostrophes of possession to possessive pronouns, which is unnecessary, since they already show possession. His, hers, its. No apostrophe needed. However, if we mean its as a shortened version of it is, then it's actually an apostrophe of omission, it apostrophe s, and would be needed. Now, to turn to those, apostrophes of omission are basically where we add apostrophes to show where words or sections of words have been missed out. So, for example, can't, C-A-N''T, rather than cannot. Could've, could apostrophe V-E, rather than could have, and so on. Now, apostrophes of omission are almost always viewed as informal, and they're best not used in any kind of formal writing. It is possible for a misplaced apostrophe to change the meaning of something, but actually that sort of thing doesn't usually really impact on our ability to understand the intended meaning, which is one reason why the stereotype of the grocer's apostrophe is actually more about snobbery quite often than about accuracy. Now, you'll find that apostrophes are a frequent error for students, and it's worth, when errors occur, recapping the logic of them and ensuring that there are rapid and repeated opportunities for correct application. As with spelling, errors can be careless and needless, but they can also be an indication of a deeper insecurity with the rules governing how these things work, and that's a wider issue to address. In simple terms, we need to check to see, is this a failure of effort and concentration, or is it one of understanding? If it's the latter, the student will need a clear explanation of what is wrong with the punctuation placement and also what the impact of it is. It's important in some ways also because the more we allow students to repeat these mistakes, the more those mistakes become embedded, reinforced, permitted, and therefore fixed. Now, there are, of course, other punctuation marks. There are parentheses, for example, brackets, which separate off comments or a section of the text. There's the three-dot ellipsis, which can either show a missing section of text or leave a sense of hanging expectation as a comment trails off. There's the hyphen, typically linking sections together, the speech marks to go around speech, inverted commas that can go around speech as well, or they can go around quotations, or even just words not to be taken literally. Now, one thing that often confuses students is how we punctuate speech. In simple terms, the speech marks simply go around whatever's being said. So it always begins with a capital letter, and sentence-ending punctuation then happens within the speech marks. So, speech marks, capital letter, the sentence, full stop, speech marks. Now, any reporting clauses, such as said Jane or shouted Paul, are viewed as continuing the sentence containing the speech, so they don't need a capital letter at the beginning. Even if the speech ends in a comma, there's the comma and then the speech marks, and then the phrase afterwards. Do watch out for students attempting to double punctuate, and that's placing an exclamation mark before the speech marks, for example, and then a full stop after them. Now, as with the others, all of this can be taught through repeated and careful application. However, it's vitally important that the impact of any punctuation mark is clarified in terms of meaning, rather than simply just offering a technical definition. That doesn't help them. It's meaning, and it's routine application, repeated application. That's what actually has the impact. Now, that's it for today, a longer session than actually I'd intended. And there's been a heck of a lot in that session. So I hope you found it useful. I hope you found it informative. I hope you found it enlightening. As ever, if you have any follow-up questions, do please steer them towards your head of department and or your director. And do also remember to log your participation in the session. Thank you very much for your time, and take care.